What if Hannibal had taken the city of Rome? Rome conquered. It was the winter of 215 BCE, what would have been the year 538 in the Roman conception of history, and what would also be the last year in their city's history. That November, a foreign conqueror entered the city, and his soldiers made camp along the course of the 7 hills of Rome on the banks of the River Tiber. The conqueror was Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who 3 years earlier had marched from Hispania along the southern coast of Gaul and then over the Alps before descending into Italy. After 2 years of campaigning around Italy and winning over many of Rome's allies amongst the Italians of the peninsula and the Greeks of the south of Italy, he had won a massive victory over the Romans at the Battle of Cannae in southern Italy on the 2nd of August 216 BCE. Tens of thousands of Romans and their allies had been killed and captured at Cannae, leaving the city of Rome dangerously exposed to Carthaginian attack. The following spring, having gathered allies from around Italy, Hannibal struck, encircling Rome and then closing in on the city. A bitter siege followed before the city fell in the early winter. Now Carthaginian victory in the Second Punic War was assured, and Rome's future rested in grave doubt. Part of this scenario did occur in reality, while part of it did not. Hannibal did invade Italy at the start of the Second Punic War in 218 BCE, and he did inflict a catastrophic defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Cannae 2 years later. However, in a move that has confounded many military historians ever since, Hannibal did not try to capture the city of Rome. As a result, the war dragged on for another decade and a half, and eventually the Romans recovered, wore down the Carthaginians, and defeated them, emerging as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean on their way to world dominion of a kind. But what would have happened if he had moved to capture Rome in 215 BCE and succeeded? Here we explore how history could have been very different if Carthage had defeated Rome. The Punic Wars. Our potential scenario of Carthage capturing the city of Rome and defeating the Roman Republic must be viewed in context. The Battle of Cannae occurred early on in a long-running conflict known as the Second Punic War. Punic comes from a Roman term for the Carthaginians, which ultimately derives from their awareness that Carthage was a colony of the Phoenicians, a powerful people of the Levant, who had settled colonies all around the Mediterranean centuries earlier. Thus, Punic comes from Phoenician. Carthage was the greatest of the Phoenician colonies and had already become one of the most powerful states in the Western Mediterranean, when Rome was still a backwater in central Italy. That changed in the 4th century BCE as the Romans expanded to conquer all of central Italy at the same time that the Carthaginians were acquiring control over Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Eventually, after Rome expanded into southern Italy and set its eyes on Sicily, the two powers clashed directly with one another. The First Punic War would last for nearly a quarter of a century, between 264 BCE and 241 BCE. It was a bitter affair in which the Roman Republic had to develop a major navy for the first time before it defeated Carthage, ending the war in control of the Italian islands. But the Carthaginians controlled lands elsewhere in North Africa and further west in the Balearic Islands and other locations. As a result, they began rebuilding their strength in the 230s and 220s BCE with a view to one day launching a new war of revenge against the Romans once they had built their strength back up sufficiently. Over this period, a Carthaginian general by the name of Hamilcar Barca concentrated on conquering much of southern and eastern Hispania, the ancient name for the Iberian Peninsula. His sons, Hasdrubal and Hannibal, inherited his mantle after he died in 228 BCE, and so it was that a new war with Rome commenced in 218 BCE, the Second Punic War. As we have seen, Hannibal soon marched from Hispania eastwards along the northern shores of the Mediterranean, over the Alps and into Italy, with the goal of defeating the Romans swiftly in their own homeland. The Battle of Cannae. We have already seen that Hannibal had inflicted a major defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Cannae in the late summer of 216 BCE. However, it is worth reviewing the exact scale of this defeat in order to appreciate how plausible it is that Hannibal could have defeated the Romans in the aftermath of it. The battle occurred in southeastern Italy, just north of modern-day Bari. If the few ancient sources we have, such as the histories of Livy and Polybius, are to be believed, then the Romans and their allies actually outnumbered the Carthaginians and their allies, fielding upwards of about 80,000 men against not much more than 50,000. And yet Hannibal inflicted a punishing defeat, encircling the enemy and then closing in to turn the battlefield into a killing pit. By the end of the day, there were reputedly between 50,000 and 70,000 dead amongst the Romans and their allies, while the vast majority of their remaining forces were taken prisoner. What was worse, the Carthaginians followed up with another victory at the Battle of Silva Latana later that year, while the allies of the Romans amongst the Italian cities of the south of the peninsula now began abandoning Rome and sided with the Carthaginians. Such was the desperation and panic in Rome that emergency measures were taken. A senior politician called Marcus Fabius Buteo was granted power of dictatores to lead the city out of the emergency, while there was even resort to human sacrifice to try and appease the gods and call on them to save Rome. It's hardly unreasonable to suggest Rome could have been conquered in the year that followed. The Conquest of Rome. Given all of this, it is not implausible that Hannibal could have conquered Rome in the course of 215 BCE. In particular, if the Carthaginian government in North Africa had followed up to deliver further reinforcements to Italy by sea from North Africa, it would have strengthened Hannibal and his allies and allowed him to conquer the city of Rome. The city itself, at that time, was hardly an impregnable stronghold. Many of the great walls that were built around Rome were the product of a much later era, notably the walls of Aurelian, built by Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century CE, nearly half a millennium after the Second Punic War. Instead, Rome had been sacked by the Gauls of Celt in 390 BCE and was still vulnerable to attack by a large army rampaging around Italy in the mid-210s BCE. Therefore, it's completely plausible that Hannibal could have laid siege to the city in the months after Cannae and conquered the city before long. The Romans wouldn't have been able to offer a huge amount of resistance. It is this which confuses many historians as to why Hannibal never tried to capture Rome at this time. Could the Romans have continued to resist? The next question that arises is whether or not the fall of the city of Rome itself would have brought about the complete collapse of Roman political and military power and the Roman Republic, or whether or not the Romans could have continued to resist the Carthaginians. For instance, the Romans had legionaries operating in different parts of Italy and an expeditionary force in Hispania by 215 BCE. Even if Hannibal had captured Rome, would these have been able to mount a resistance? It seems unlikely. Such a war would have been a guerrilla conflict, or almost a kind of counter-insurgency war. But the idea of fighting asymmetrical warfare like this is a very modern concept. Nations did not fight in this way back in ancient times for the most part. That would not by itself make it impossible. But with the majority of the Roman citizenry effectively hostage to Hannibal and his armies in Rome and central Italy, where would further reinforcements of the kind needed have come from? This is especially the case when we consider the small logistical base from which the Romans were operating. It's hard to remember when we consider how big the Roman Empire eventually became, but in the 3rd century BCE, the number of people who were actually Roman citizens was very small, limited to free inhabitants of the city of Rome itself and the surrounding regions of Latium in central Italy. Most of those who lived under Roman rule in Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica were subject people, many of whom had already abandoned the Romans and allied with the Carthaginians following the Battle of Cannae. If the city of Rome had fallen, it's very hard to see how the Romans could have fought back effectively. Their biggest chance might have been that they could have negotiated a humiliating peace treaty with Carthage in which they ceded control of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica back to Carthage, and probably have relinquished control over the vast majority of their lands in Italy as well. In such a scenario, Rome would have been reduced back to being a small city-state of the kind it had been 2 centuries earlier, and one largely under Carthaginian control at that. It's very hard to imagine them ever returning to being a major power thereafter if Hannibal had imposed punitive enough terms on them. Perhaps the city would simply have been leveled to the ground, much as the Romans did in actuality to Carthage in 146 BCE at the end of the Third Punic War. The Carthaginian world order. Let's assume, then, that once Hannibal conquered and defeated the Romans, that Rome would have been thoroughly defeated and would never have emerged as the dominant power of the Mediterranean, which it soon became. What might have replaced it? After all, it's very difficult to imagine what the history of the ancient world might have looked like from the 2nd century BCE onwards, if Rome is taken out of the picture. What seems most likely is that the Carthaginians would have emerged in their place as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean, at least. The Punic Wars were essentially a clash between Rome and Carthage for mastery over the region encompassing the Maghreb, Hispania, Italy, and southern Gaul, what we would now term the French Riviera. Had Hannibal defeated the Romans and conquered their capital, the Carthaginians would have moved to become the hegemonic power of the Western Mediterranean and would have achieved this fairly quickly. What is less clear is whether or not they would have then expanded eastwards into places like Greece, Turkey, and the Levant, in the manner which the Romans did in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. They might have, but the Carthaginian war machine was not as efficient as that of the Romans, and it is probably stretching matters to think that a Carthaginian empire on the scale of the Roman Empire could have been formed, one stretching from Britain to Sudan and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Thus, the Carthaginians would have become a major power in the Western Mediterranean for hundreds of years to come, but other powers would have emerged to the east. It is plausible to imagine the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt and the Seleucid Empire persisting as major powers for centuries to come, or that the Parthian Empire based out of Persia and Mesopotamia would have conquered lands further west to the Mediterranean Sea. While we can make a fairly educated guess at how extensive the Carthaginian Empire might have become had it defeated Rome, it's much less clear as to what that state might have looked like politically, socially, culturally, and economically. Simply put, as great a power as Carthage was for several centuries, between around 600 BCE and 200 BCE, we know very little about what Carthaginian culture and society looked like or how it functioned. This is because the Romans consciously tried to obliterate all knowledge of it after they destroyed the city of Carthage in 146 BCE. We have, for instance, only a handful of Carthaginian texts that have survived from antiquity, quoted secondhand in Roman books. Given this, it's difficult to construct a view of how a Carthaginian-ruled Western Mediterranean would have looked. It would have been an oligarchy, ruled by a small Carthaginian aristocratic class, much like the Roman senatorial class that ruled the Roman Republic, while a polytheistic religion of dozens of major gods and goddesses, not entirely dissimilar to the Roman, Greek, and Egyptian systems, would have prevailed. Beyond this, we are largely left to guess what might have been. An unknowable history. Beyond hypothesizing that the Carthaginians would have become the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean, it is hard to encapsulate how vastly different the history of much of the world might have been had the Roman Republic been conquered by Hannibal during the Second Punic War. Rome went on to rule much of the known world and shape the history of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for thousands of years. It was only in 1453 that the Eastern Roman Empire, a direct successor to the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, was conquered, over 1,650 years after the Battle of Cannae. The Roman civil law continues to shape legal systems all over the world today. Hundreds of millions of people around the world today speak languages such as Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian that are Romance languages derived from Latin, the tongue of the Romans, while English is a hybrid Romance and Germanic language. The point here is that had the Romans been crushed and removed from the scene before they ever ascended to dominate the known world, then the history of the entire world would have been very different. So different that it is hard to fathom what might have happened instead. Perhaps another major power would have emerged. Perhaps a Germanic power would have conquered the Mediterranean lands and adopted Greek culture in a similar vein to their needs in the same way the Romans did after the Punic Wars. Perhaps the Arabs of Arabia, who finally united and conquered the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century CE, would have done so anyway, but conquered much of Europe as well. If they did so, it would probably have been for non-religious reasons, as the very emergence of Islam in Arabia in the early 7th century CE was brought about by the earlier spread of Christianity there under Roman influence. The list of ways in which the world would be different if the Romans had been vanquished is very long indeed. And imagine, it all could have happened quite easily if Hannibal had dared to try and conquer the city of Rome in 215 BCE. Such are the seemingly small events that huge historical changes can pivot around. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to show your support and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.